The emergency lights inside the diplomatic vessel flickered, casting long shadows across the curved silver walls. Commander Tevrix glided into the conference chamber, his elongated limbs stiff with urgency. His skin, a translucent shade of blue, shimmered under the sparse lighting. In the center of the room sat the Earth envoy, Calvin Vance, hunched over a bulky metal case he had been fiddling with for the past hour. "Envoy Calvin," Tevrix said in a tense, gravelly tone. "You must listen carefully. We have identified a lethal parasite on board. It is resilient, invasive, and it is inside your body." Calvin looked up from his case, eyebrows raised. His rugged, slightly weathered face showed no panic, only a tired curiosity. He scratched the back of his neck and leaned back in the chair, the metal creaking under his weight. "A parasite, huh?" Calvin said. "What does it look like?" Tevrix projected a hologram from the device embedded in his wrist. A worm-like creature appeared, segmented and writhing, its head lined with hooks. Calvin stared at it for a moment, then let out a dry laugh. "That's just a tapeworm," he said. "Easy fix." Tevrix recoiled slightly. "You know of this organism?" "Yeah," Calvin said, standing up and stretching his back with a grunt. "Had a buddy back in Arizona who got one from eating undercooked pork. Disgusting, sure, but not deadly if you catch it early." Tevrix's thin mouth twitched. "Envoy Calvin, on our worlds, this parasite decimates entire populations. It can grow unchecked, burrow through vital organs, and resist most known treatments." Calvin shrugged. "Well, on Earth, we got pills for that. Knock it right out." Tevrix hesitated. "You have pharmaceuticals capable of exterminating this entity?" "Sure do," Calvin said, reaching into his case and pulling out a battered first aid kit. He rummaged through it until he found a small orange bottle. "Praziquantel. Been around for decades." The alien leaned closer, examining the bottle as if it were a sacred relic. "You carry this cure with you?" "Always," Calvin said. "Never know when you might get unlucky with alien food." He tucked the bottle back into the case and snapped it shut. "But thanks for the heads up. Appreciate the concern." Tevrix straightened, visibly trying to regain his composure. "We must still proceed with caution. The parasite may have adapted to interstellar conditions." Calvin nodded. "Fair point. How'd you find out I had it, anyway?" "We detected abnormal biological readings during routine scans," Tevrix said. "Your internal systems are tumultuous." "That's just being human," Calvin said with a grin. "We got all kinds of weird bacteria and critters living inside us. Part of the package." Tevrix's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. After a long pause, he said, "We must perform a full diagnostic." "Lead the way," Calvin said. He hoisted his case onto his shoulder and followed Tevrix down the winding, dimly lit corridors of the ship. They entered a sterile examination room where a squat, moss-green alien named Davra waited beside a machine that resembled an MRI scanner fused with a meat grinder. Calvin eyed it warily. "Lay down," Davra said in a clipped voice. Calvin hesitated. "That thing's safe." "Mostly," Davra said. Calvin muttered something under his breath but climbed onto the slab. The machine hummed to life, bathing him in a cold, tingling light. After several minutes, Davra studied a translucent screen filled with readouts and squiggling graphs. "You have significant infestation," Davra said. "How bad is significant?" Calvin asked. "Parasite length is approximately 2 meters," Davra said, "segmented into hundreds of parts. It has embedded itself along your intestinal tract." Calvin winced. "Yeah, that tracks." Tevrix loomed over him. "We must remove it immediately. Surgery is recommended." Calvin sat up, wincing as his stomach gave a sharp, twisting pain. "Hold on. Surgery? No need for that. I can take the medication, and it'll flush out naturally." Davra made a skeptical noise. "Primitive methods. They work," Calvin said. "Trust me." Tevrix and Davra exchanged a series of rapid, low-pitched sounds, then Tevrix said, "Very well. You will administer your cure under observation." Calvin popped open the orange bottle, shook 2 pills into his hand, and swallowed them dry. "Now we wait." Hours passed. Calvin remained under observation, sipping water and occasionally grimacing as his insides churned. Tevrix monitored him with a mixture of fascination and horror. At one point, Calvin doubled over, clutching his gut. Tevrix jumped forward. "Should we intervene?" Calvin shook his head through gritted teeth. "Nope. Just means it's working." True to his word, several hours later, Calvin stumbled into the sanitation chamber, and spent the next half hour enduring one of the most unpleasant experiences of his life. When he emerged, pale and sweating, he gave a shaky thumbs up. Mission accomplished, he croaked. Davra scanned him again and nodded. Parasite eliminated. Tevrix regarded him in stunned silence. You eradicated a deadly parasite with 2 capsules and bodily expulsion. Yep, Calvin said, leaning heavily against the wall. Welcome to humanity. Tevrix's brow furrowed. Your species is unnervingly resilient. Calvin gave a weak chuckle. We have our moments. Davra handed him a nutrient pack. You must replenish fluids and electrolytes. Calvin tore it open and drank greedily, grimacing at the taste. What flavor is this? Old socks. High efficiency, Davra said. Figures, Calvin muttered. Later, as he rested in the infirmary, Tevrix sat beside him, watching with the intensity of a hawk. Calvin shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny. You're not going to dissect me or anything, are you? Calvin asked. We are merely studying, Tevrix said. Well, study away, Calvin said. But next time, maybe trust me when I say I know what I'm doing. Tevrix inclined his head. It is difficult to reconcile your primitive appearance with your astounding adaptability. Calvin laughed weakly. Story of my life. Before long, alarms blared again. Tevrix sprang up. Another infestation detected. Calvin groaned. Not me this time, right? No, Tevrix said. Another crew member. They hurried to the secondary infirmary where a young alien technician writhed on a slab, his body convulsing. Calvin watched for a moment and said, Same parasite? Confirmed, Davra said. I'll need a translator, Calvin said, grabbing his case. I'll walk him through it. Tevrix looked doubtful. He is not human. Doesn't matter, Calvin said. Pain's universal. He moved to the technician's side and spoke calmly, demonstrating how to swallow the pills and explaining what symptoms to expect. The young alien hesitated, then complied. Hours later, the technician staggered out of the sanitation chamber, looking even worse than Calvin had earlier, but alive and parasite-free. You are formidable, Tevrix said. Just stubborn, Calvin said. In the following days, Calvin trained a small team of aliens on basic parasite treatment protocols. They adapted quickly, though with less enthusiasm for the less glamorous parts of the process. One evening, as Calvin sat in the observation deck, staring out at the stars, Tevrix approached. You have altered our medical protocols, Tevrix said. Calvin looked over. Glad I could help. You have also altered our perception of your kind, Tevrix added. Calvin smiled. Not sure if that's good or bad. It is. Enlightening, Tevrix said. They stood in companionable silence, watching the stars drift by. Calvin shifted his weight, still sore from the ordeal. Next time, I'm packing more meds. Tevrix nodded solemnly. Next time, we will ensure better culinary vetting. Calvin chuckled. Deal. And so, a human and a ship full of incredulous aliens sailed through the stars, bound together by the most unexpected of alliances, an old Earth medicine, a stubborn will to survive, and the shared relief that sometimes the simplest solutions were the most effective. The sterile tang of disinfectants still hung heavy in the air as Calvin adjusted the loose gray tunic the med-bay staff had given him. It was slightly too short in the arms and smelled faintly of burnt plastic. He scratched at the collar, glancing around the room where half a dozen aliens bustled about, calibrating unfamiliar devices and muttering in low, rhythmic clicks. Davra, still wearing the same moss-colored uniform, approached with a flat white tablet in hand. You are scheduled for a nutritional recalibration, she said, tapping the screen rapidly. Calvin raised an eyebrow. That sounds suspiciously like a forced diet. Necessary, Davra said, handing him the tablet. You have depleted your internal reserves. He scanned the list. Most of the items were unpronounceable. The only thing he recognized was something called Protein Slurry 7. Got anything that tastes like real food? Calvin asked. Davra tilted her head. Define real. Anything that doesn't come in a tube or smell like an air filter, Calvin said. Davra considered this for a moment, then gestured for him to follow. They wound through a series of narrow, humming corridors until they reached a small galley. Rows of compartments lined the walls, each labeled with indecipherable symbols. Davra punched a sequence into one of the dispensers. A tray slid out, holding a steaming mound of something purple and gelatinous. Edible, she said. Calvin poked it with a metal fork. The substance wobbled violently, then settled into an uneasy stillness. "You know," he said, "on Earth, food usually doesn't fight back." Davra blinked slowly. "It is inert." "Sure looks it," Calvin said, and took a cautious bite. The texture reminded him of overcooked octopus, if octopus were somehow infused with sadness and battery acid. He choked it down with a grimace. This might be a war crime. "You require sustenance," Davra said, ignoring his gagging noises. Calvin shoved another bite into his mouth, determined to get it over with. Halfway through, the door hissed open and Tevrix entered, carrying a thin, iridescent bundle under one arm. "You are needed," Tevrix said without preamble. "A situation has developed." Calvin wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Can't it wait until after I finish my delicious meal?" "No," Tevrix said. Davra took the tray from him without ceremony and deposited it into a wall chute, where it vanished with a wet slurp. Calvin followed Tevrix back into the corridors, his stomach lurching slightly from the combination of medication and whatever he had just consumed. They arrived at an observation deck overlooking a quarantine chamber. Inside, a tall, amber-skinned alien thrashed against restraints, his segmented limbs twitching spasmodically. A cluster of med techs monitored from behind a reinforced barrier. "What's his story?" Calvin asked. Tevrix adjusted the bundle under his arm, revealing it to be a sterile suit woven with shimmering fibers. "He consumed contaminated organic matter obtained from an unregulated vendor." Calvin winced. "Street food, huh? Classic mistake." "The parasite has adapted," Tevrix said grimly. "It exhibits resistance to your pharmaceutical treatment." Calvin frowned. "That was fast." "Your intervention remains the most effective approach," Tevrix said. "But modifications are required." Calvin took the suit and began pulling it on over his tunic. The material clung like a second skin, cool and oddly comforting. "You want me to go in there?" he said, adjusting the helmet seals. "You are the only individual with direct experiential knowledge," Tevrix said. "Great," Calvin muttered. "I'm the parasite whisperer." He stepped into the decontamination chamber. Jets of cold mist enveloped him, and a series of harsh blue lights scanned him from head to toe. When the inner door opened, the smell hit him immediately, a sharp, metallic tang, like copper and ozone. The infected alien, whose nameplate read Krevix, snapped his head toward Calvin with a snarl. Veins beneath his translucent skin pulsed an angry crimson. "Easy, buddy," Calvin said, raising both hands. "I'm here to help." Krevix hissed something unintelligible, then convulsed, collapsing onto the floor. Calvin approached cautiously, kneeling beside him. "All right, let's see what we're dealing with," he muttered. Using a handheld scanner from the wall, Calvin began assessing vital signs. Heart rate spiked dangerously high, respiration shallow. He tapped into the ship's medical database, skimming the alien physiology charts. Krevix's digestive tract was similar enough to human anatomy that Calvin felt reasonably confident. He spoke aloud, mostly for the benefit of the observing med techs. "If the parasite is resistant, we need a multi-pronged approach. High-dose anti-helminthics combined with mechanical purging." Davra's voice crackled through the intercom. "Specify treatment." Calvin thought for a moment. "I need a stronger anthelmintic agent, something broad-spectrum, plus a laxative powerful enough to clear a clogged drain." There was a brief pause. "Compounds being synthesized," Davra said. Krevix moaned weakly, his limbs trembling. Calvin placed a reassuring hand on the alien's shoulder. "Hang in there, pal. I've pulled worse things out of worse places." Minutes later, a small drone zipped into the chamber, carrying 2 vials. Calvin injected the first directly into Krevix's vein, watching the readouts for any immediate reaction. The second vial, a viscous green liquid, he administered orally, coaxing Krevix to swallow. For the next hour, Calvin monitored him closely. At first, nothing happened. Then Krevix's body tensed, his abdomen rippling unnaturally. "Here we go," Calvin said grimly. Krevix convulsed once, then twice, before violently expelling a mass of writhing, segmented organisms onto the floor. Calvin recoiled instinctively but maintained his composure, grabbing a containment unit from the wall and shoving the parasites inside. The medbay crew flooded in the moment the all-clear sounded, whisking Krevix away for further stabilization. Calvin peeled off the suit, drenched in sweat. Tevrix approached, his expression unreadable. "You have again succeeded," Tevrix said. "Yeah," Calvin said, wiping his forehead. "But that thing?" It mutated fast. If it keeps changing, the meds might not keep up. Tevrix nodded gravely. We must adapt as you do. Calvin grinned tiredly. Welcome to the club. Several hours later, Calvin sat in a small lounge overlooking the ship's engine core. The hum of the machinery was oddly soothing, almost like rain against a window pane back home. Davra entered, carrying a narrow vial filled with bioluminescent liquid. This is derived from your blood sample, she said. It demonstrates remarkable resistance properties. Calvin took the vial, turning it over in his hand. Tiny sparkles danced inside the fluid. You're thinking of synthesizing treatments based on my immune response, he said. Correct, Davra said. Your species' symbiotic microbiota appears to grant unexpected resilience. Calvin chuckled. We're basically walking petri dishes. Davra regarded him thoughtfully. A chaotic yet effective biological strategy. He set the vial down carefully. Chaos is kinda our thing. Davra hesitated, then said, Would you consent to donating further biological samples? Calvin gave a mock sigh. Only if you promise not to clone me. Universe barely handles one of me as it is. We have no such intentions, Davra said seriously. Good, Calvin said, leaning back in the chair. Last thing you need is an army of grumpy humans running around. The ship's lights dimmed slightly, signaling the beginning of the artificial night cycle. Calvin yawned, the exhaustion finally catching up with him. Get some rest, Davra said. Further procedures can wait. Calvin pushed himself up, joints protesting. That's the best thing I've heard all day. On his way to his quarters, he passed a group of young aliens practicing emergency medical drills, each clutching a mock-up of the orange pill bottle he had used. Their instructor barked corrections, emphasizing dosage and timing. Calvin paused, watching for a moment. Despite the strangeness of it all, there was something familiar in their intense focus, their clumsy enthusiasm. It reminded him of rookie medics back on Earth, fumbling but determined. He smiled and continued down the corridor, feeling, for the first time since boarding the ship, a cautious optimism stirring in his chest. Somewhere out there, he thought, the galaxy was full of horrors humanity had never even dreamed of. But maybe, just maybe, humanity had a few surprises left for the galaxy too. A low chime vibrated through the ship's corridors, signaling mid-cycle. Calvin shuffled into the medbay again, this time under his own steam, feeling only mildly hollowed out from everything he'd endured. The place was busier now. Aliens of different sizes and colors moved briskly between stations, their once timid glances at him replaced with cautious familiarity. Davra waved him over to a workstation. You are required for final clearance. Calvin dropped into the nearest chair, stretching his legs out. Final clearance sounds like something you tell someone before an execution. Davra ignored the comment and handed him a slim patch. Place this on your skin. It will confirm parasite absence. He peeled the adhesive backing off and slapped it onto the inside of his forearm. A soft warmth spread under the patch, and tiny lights flickered along its edge. Across the room, Tevrix stood with two other officers, speaking in low tones. When he noticed Calvin, he broke away and approached. You are recovering adequately, Tevrix said. Define adequately, Calvin said, flexing his fingers. I feel like a used punching bag. Tevrix made a brief, humming sound. Acceptable parameters. The patch on Calvin's arm beeped softly. Davra leaned over, checked the readout, and nodded once. You are cleared, she said. About time, Calvin said, peeling the patch off and tossing it into a disposal chute. Tevrix gestured toward a nearby conference alcove. There is another matter. Calvin followed him, plopping into one of the curved seats while Tevrix remained standing, hands clasped behind his back. We have analyzed the parasite samples you obtained, Tevrix said. They were not naturally occurring. Calvin raised an eyebrow. You're telling me someone engineered them? Correct, Tevrix said. Their genetic material contains artificial markers. Great, Calvin said, rubbing his temples. So it wasn't bad cooking. It was bioterrorism. We do not yet know the perpetrator, Tevrix said. But we have neutralized all active threats on board. Calvin exhaled slowly. At least there's that. Tevrix tilted his head. Your exposure has provided valuable data. Happy to be your lab rat, Calvin said dryly. Tevrix didn't react to the sarcasm. We have synthesized a new treatment protocol based on your immune responses. It will be distributed among the fleet. Good, Calvin said. He leaned back, closing his eyes briefly. Anything else? There is a ceremony, Tevrix said. Calvin's eyes snapped open. And what now? A formal recognition of your contributions, Tevrix said. Attendance is mandatory. Calvin groaned. Tell me it doesn't involve speeches. There will be minimal oration, Tevrix said. Fantastic, Calvin muttered. 2 hours later, Calvin found himself standing awkwardly in the main assembly hall. The room was cavernous, walls lined with shifting metallic banners displaying the ship's insignia. Hundreds of aliens filled the tiered seating, their eyes gleaming with curiosity. At the center of the stage, a small podium had been erected. Behind it, a shallow basin filled with a glowing blue liquid pulsed gently. Davra approached, carrying a thin metallic object shaped like a flattened spiral. This is a symbol of adaptive excellence, she said, pressing it into Calvin's palm. It is customary to accept it publicly. He turned the object over in his hand. It was surprisingly heavy. Does it come with a cash prize? Calvin asked, only half joking. Davra blinked. No, worth a shot, Calvin said, pocketing it. Tevrix stepped up to the podium. The room fell silent. Today we recognize a being whose resilience and ingenuity preserved this vessel and its crew, Tevrix said. His voice, though amplified, remained calm. Envoy Calvin Vance of Earth. A ripple of sound moved through the crowd. Calvin shuffled forward, resisting the urge to wave like an idiot. He dipped his fingers into the basin, as Davra had instructed earlier, and touched them to his forehead. The liquid left a faint, shimmering mark that quickly faded. The crowd emitted a low, harmonic tone of sound that vibrated in Calvin's chest like a second heartbeat. Tevrix handed him a narrow strip of cloth, deep indigo with silver threading. Calvin draped it over his shoulders, feeling ridiculous but also oddly honored. The ceremony ended swiftly, much to Calvin's relief. As the audience dispersed, Tevrix lingered beside him. You have earned the right to request a favor, Tevrix said. Calvin thought for a moment. I want a decent meal. Something that doesn't look like a science experiment. Tevrix gave a slight nod. Granted. That evening, Calvin was ushered into a smaller dining hall reserved for senior officers. The lighting was soft, the air warmer, less sterile. Davra and another alien named Vren, whose skin was patterned with faint geometric designs, stood beside a long table laden with platters. Vren gestured toward the spread. We have prepared a selection based on your species' nutritional requirements. Calvin eyed the offerings. There were roasted tubers resembling sweet potatoes, skewered meats that smelled tantalizingly like lamb, and a flatbread that steamed gently under a cloth. He picked up a plate and began piling food onto it with the enthusiasm of a starving man. This, Calvin said around a mouthful of tuber, is the best thing that's happened to me all week. Davra watched him with mild curiosity. Your appreciation of sustenance is unusually intense. Starvation will do that to you, Calvin said, reaching for another skewer. Vren tilted his head. Are all humans this? Food motivated? Pretty much, Calvin said. We fight wars over spices. Davra exchanged a glance with Vren. Your species is volatile. Calvin grinned. Yeah, but we're fun at parties. Later, when the meal was over and the plates cleared away by silent drones, Calvin leaned back in his chair, feeling more human than he had in days. Tevrix approached with a small data chip. This contains the updated medical protocols, he said. We intend to disseminate them across allied fleets. Calvin accepted the chip. Good. Maybe next time one of us gets infected, we won't have to play guess and die. Tevrix inclined his head. Your contribution will be noted in the Central Archives. Calvin snorted. Hope they spell my name right. Davra remained standing nearby, arms loosely crossed. You intend to return to Earth? She asked. Calvin considered it. Eventually, but I figure I'll stick around a bit longer. Someone's got to make sure you guys don't poison yourselves again. Tevrix's mouth twitched in what Calvin was beginning to recognize as amusement. We welcome your continued presence, he said. As the artificial night cycle deepened, the group dispersed, leaving Calvin alone on the observation deck. He leaned against the railing, staring out at the endless expanse of stars. For the first time since boarding the alien ship, he truly felt like he belonged an odd, stubborn creature among beings who barely understood him but valued him all the same. He tapped the data chip against his palm thoughtfully. Maybe humanity wasn't the most advanced species out here. But when it came to surviving the impossible with a grin and a bottle of outdated pills, they were second to none. And that, Calvin figured, was worth more than any medal or ceremony. It was what made them human. It was what made them unstoppable.